Welcome everybody to our session on the angels of God. This is being recorded for christadelphianvideos.org, and my name is Ron Cowie from South Australia. We're now going to move on to a continuation of this subject of the angels that surround us, and particularly, as we said, to appreciate how God sends them to work in our lives. And we're looking at that third aspect at the moment in our consideration of the angels. So how does God work with the angels in our lives? Well, today we're going to look at another one of the patriarchs particularly, and this is, of course, Jacob. Now, Jacob was a man who ended up wrestling with an angel and had an angel face to face like no one else ever had, perhaps, in the art of wrestling with him. But Jacob is a great example because Jacob's life was not a trouble-free life. Now, in Genesis 28 and verse 13, we have a remarkable verse that we just need to correct from the authorized version. And you can pick it up in the RV, and other translations also pick this up. So in Genesis 28, when Jacob is leaving home on his way to Padan Aram to find a wife, he makes a pillow of a stone at Bethel. And he has this dream about the angels of God ascending and descending on a staircase to heaven. And again, just notice that the top of it goes to heaven, the angels ascend and descend. So the actual regular place is on the earth. So here is Jacob sleeping. And then in verse 13, reading as it should be in the Greek and as the RV corrects it, behold, Yahweh stood by him. And there again is your standing by. And later on he says in verse 15, I am with thee in all the places whither thou goest, I'll bring thee again. I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. So it was absolutely clear that this angel was there to stay with Jacob all the way through his life, never to leave him. I will never leave thee. So we have this promise of angelic guidance that was given to Jacob on that occasion. Now notice what it says there. I am with thee, and I will keep thee in all the places whither thou goest, and I will bring you back to this land. When God gave the angel to Israel in the wilderness, he said to Moses, behold, I sent an angel before thee. He shall keep thee in the way and bring thee into the place promised unto the fathers. So again, that's what the angels are all about. They are to watch over us, to guide us, to bring the things happen in our life, to develop our characters. But in the end, their work is to bring us into the kingdom of God, when the whole family of God shall become one. So the angel's work is to be with us and to make us ready for the kingdom. And Jacob was on the beginning of his life's journey. So we're not going to deal with the whole life story of Jacob, but just noting some of the times when angels were directly and openly involved. In Genesis 28, we have the promise of angelic care through his life. There was a whole period of perhaps some 40 years where he was in Padan Aram, under the tutorship of Laban, getting his two wives, having a large family, increasing his herds. And all of that time, there was virtually no appearance of angels. There were miraculous things happening, like the increase of his herds that we read about in Genesis 29:30 around that time, where there was a dramatic, unexpected genetic casting towards whatever Jacob was collecting. So again, the angels were working behind the scenes. Jacob perhaps thought that it was his wit and his cunning that was doing it, but for many years, he went through a lot of agony without any direct connection with the angel. But when we come to Genesis chapter 31, when the time has come for Jacob to go back to his homeland and to leave Padan Aram and to leave Laban, he has now a vision, a revelation about what has been going on. And the angel says to him, Jacob says in Genesis 31 verse 5, he tells his wives that Laban's countenance is not very happy anymore. Laban's seeing his flocks diminished and Jacob's increasing. And then he explains that he's actually had a vision. And he says in verse 7, God, or the Elohim, has suffered him not to hurt me. And he actually then recognizes that the increase of the herds has not come through his own wisdom or cunning. It had actually come because God had been directing the genetics of that flock. And you get this angelic blessing being revealed. It goes right through this section where he actually Jacob acknowledges that God has been protecting him all along. Well, then he sneaks away, and then of course Laban goes after him. In verse 24, Elohim came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and told him not to interfere with Jacob, not to harm Jacob. So again, the angels are protecting him from Laban. And then we come to chapter 32, verse 1 and 2. And I want to deal with chapter 32 quite a bit today. But again, we find in verse 1 and 2, Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. So here was an open revelation of the angels. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's army." That, of course, ties up with what we've heard about the angels being the army of God. And he called the name of the place Mahanaim. So Jacob now gets a revelation of a tremendous company of angels, and they would have been right in the sky all around his campsite. And he actually said, Mahanaim, two camps, my camp and the angels' camp. And he was wrong. And that had to be brought out of him through this chapter, because it was one camp. It was the angels and Jacob in one camp. And that's how it should have been. And that's where David gets the word from. The angel encamps around those that love and fear them. But this is taken straight from Mahanaim. And here's Jacob seeing God's host all around him, because he's going back to now face up Esau. The last time he saw Esau, Esau's face was a picture of absolute rage and determination to kill Jacob. And we're going to see how that this is sorted out. But I want you to come to Genesis 48, verse 15, because on his deathbed, after a long life of trouble and strife, Jacob says this in the blessing of his sons. He blessed Joseph and said, Elohim, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the Elohim which fed me all the day long unto this day. And my interpretation of God there as Elohim is correct, because verse 16 says, the angel which redeemed me from all evil. Bless the lads. So you can see there that Jacob is talking about how God worked in his life through the presence of that angel, the angel that redeemed him. Didn't save him from trouble, but actually brought him through it, preserved him, and actually gave him much hope at the end of his life. So Jacob's supreme confession of faith was that I can now see the angel has been with me all along, even when I felt I was alone. So that's the little summary of the angels in the life of Joseph. But notice that there's a long gap. There's a 40-year gap between leaving home and when the angels work on his coming home. Now, Jacob went through many family struggles. It was a divided home. Favoritism of Isaac to Esau meant trouble back at home where they lived. He had a profane brother, Esau, married to Canaanite women, which was a great grief to his parents. A dominant mother who overrode his conscience, particularly in the matter of trying to get the blessing. Esau's hatred and threats of murder. Esau was waiting for his father to die, and he was going to kill Jacob straight away. And so he was exiled way away from home to be away from the danger of Esau. He was ruthlessly exploited by Laban, given tremendous work to do out there in the fields year after year. And Laban, of course, was the master crafter of extracting every last penny and constantly changing his wages all the time. Bitter disappointments, given the wrong wife, then finding that Rachel was barren, bickering amongst the wives, the death of Rachel, evil sons. But you got to look at what the record says in chapter 38 about Judah and his evil, to see what sort of evil sons were around him. And even Joseph had to tell his father of their evil report. Then we have the case of Dinah at Shechem, defiled by the prince of Shechem. Jealous sons, who were jealous of Joseph. The fear of the Canaanites after the destruction of the Shechemites. The loss of Joseph. The famine that then came upon them in the land. The loss of Simeon to Egypt and the threatened loss of Benjamin. No wonder Jacob could say at that particular point, all these things are against me. He had a very, very troubled life. And that's just to mention a few of the things that went wrong in the family of Jacob. But it just shows you that even though the angels are around us, it does not take away the struggles of life. And that was something Jacob had to learn, that God was working, even though he went through many, many tribulations. Again, Brother Roberts, just repeating that, trouble is often a preparation for good even now. And Jacob had to learn that lesson as much as Joseph did. So what God does here in chapter 32 is he actually opens his eyes, just like Elisha and the young man at Dothan. They were going to see the angelic host all around them. And Jacob now sees this tremendous company of angels completely encircling his camp as he goes to meet his brother Esau. And his eyes were open to see that. Now, Jacob is greatly concerned. He has enormous herds now to worry about. In fact, the present he gave to Esau, the present he sent before him just as a token or a gift, was 588 animals, which gives you some idea of the quantity of animals that must have been coming down from Padan Aram as the possession of Jacob. And so he divides his company into two bands or two groups and sends them in different directions, just in case Esau should try and slaughter one, the other might survive. And he's in greatly distressed over what's happening. And he called it this the day of his distress, because he knows that Esau, when he last saw him, was determined to kill him. And Esau, he hears, is coming with 450 men. And coming as they were from down south in Edom, they would have been riding upon camels. They were a very, very dangerous force. They were all armed men. And Jacob is now greatly afraid and greatly distressed because of the fear he has for his family and his flocks. Now, his obsession with Esau's face, you can imagine that for 40 years he'd had this picture of the angry, twisted face of Esau that he last saw. And in Genesis 32, verse 20, we have part of his prayer where, and I'm going to get it translated here as it is in the literal Hebrew, because the Authorized Version translation has lost a lot of the power of what Jacob prayed. And he said this, for he said, I will cover Esau's face with the present that goes before my face, and after it I'll see his face, and he will accept my face. And that's literally what the Hebrew has. So all Jacob can see is the fact that he and Esau are going to come face to face, and it's going to be a very dangerous confrontation. And so even in this prayer, he and all this things he's doing in setting up the different herds and flocks and camps and groups of people is all about trying to appease the fate of Esau. And he's looking in the wrong direction, and God has to show him that. So when he's done all the things he can do, he then begins to pray. And as he prays through the night, he comes and an angel comes and wrestles with him. Now, we need to understand that at any point, the angel could have finished this off either by killing him, injuring him, or just walking away. There was no lack of strength on the part of the angel. What the angel did was to make Jacob wrestle to hang on to him, because it had to take most of the night. Jacob had been praying into the middle of the night, and the angel kept him there until the morning. In fact, the angel actually challenged him, said, the morning's coming, you better get going. Are you going to go back to your natural devices, your natural instincts, your planning, or are you going to stay here with me? And in the end, Jacob was forced to say, no, I'm going to stay with you. I will not let you go till you bless me. So God is making Jacob realize that his dependence is upon the angel, not upon his own wit and wisdom and cunning. And that's something which we must all learn, is that even when things seem to be desperate, we must lean upon God and stay with God and to hang on to the promises God has made to us. And Jacob says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Well, Hosea comments on this. He says, in his manly vigor, in other words, as he came to maturity in his spiritual thinking, strove he with Elohim, he strove against an angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication to him. He didn't defeat the angel. He prevailed over himself. He prevailed over his natural instincts to go and to plan and to do cunning things and to try and appease Esau with presents. He won the battle because he actually matured to the point where he relied upon the angel. And so he stayed with that angel until he got the blessing and the assurance that God will protect him from Esau. So it's a wonderful thing, isn't it, that happened? Well, his mature conclusion is this. I've got to look at God and not at Esau. Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, because it's called the faces of Ale. For I have seen Elohim face to face, and my life is preserved. So I am saved. I can be sure now that everything's going to work out okay. I won't be killed by Esau, because I have learned to stare into the face of the angel and not think about the face of Esau. And he's now matured, as Hosea said. He's actually prevailed over his natural instincts. He's now matured spiritually to rely upon God. And so he called it Peniel. Well, the angel worked it out, didn't he? When Esau and him meet, as the proverb says in chapter 16, verse 7, when a man's ways please Yahweh, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. And the mature Jacob, when he finally catches up with the camp, finds that Esau is in a very friendly mood and that the fear that he had was completely unfounded. And Esau doesn't even want the presents. So, isn't it amazing how God can sort these things out? And that's how Jacob learned his lesson, to rely upon God and not upon his own natural cunning and wisdom, which is what Jacob's problem was all along. So it's all about character development. He was put through all of those life struggles, all of those difficult situations, all of that fear and distress, all of that. The angel was completely in control. He would never have been put to death by anyone, but he was preserved. But in the process, his character was developed. And that's what God is doing with all of his children. So we can learn a lot from Jacob. Now, this is a quote from the book Wrestling Jacob. And this is given to you because I think it's one of the best summaries I've ever heard about what Jacob can teach us. There are many Jacobs in the service of God today. Many who have received clear, gracious, divine assurances of the forgiveness of sins, of unfailing heavenly care and guidance, and of ceaseless angelic concern for all their affairs, and yet who live as though convinced that their own wit and wisdom and scheming and contriving are worth more than anything that the heavenly minister can achieve. It is enough to make angels weep with disappointment. Yet happily, with some, the day of realization comes, as it did for Jacob, early enough to transform a life of assertive self-independence into a pilgrimage of faith. And this meeting with the angel in Genesis 32 was the transforming point from the life of Jacob to that self-dependent, cunning, scheming person that he was born to be, to a pilgrimage of faith the rest of his life. And so he could say, the angel that redeemed me through all evil, bless the lads. So Jacob is a great example of God working with us and actually working in the life of Jacob in such a way. So again, Robert Roberts, all natural things are not divine. And there are many things in life, as we know, that God is not particularly concerned to interfere with. Few of them are. If we cannot make out which are and which are not, we need not be concerned. Sufficient that God may be at work when things when things are apparently natural. It is ours to conform in all modesty to what God has required, without reference to the indeterminable question of where and when he works during the present walk of faith. And some people spend an inordinate amount of time trying to work out providence in their lives and to actually even put God to the challenge by saying, well, if this happens, then I'll do this. No, that's not how it works. God is working a work in us, which sometimes involves things going wrong, sometimes things in our lives being very hard to understand. It's all about sealing the servants of God. And we shouldn't spend a lot of time trying to ponder on whether or not God is working at any particular point. There may be just natural events that God is allowing to happen. Other times, God will change them to his will and purpose with us. What we've got to do is to be more concerned about conforming to what God has required of us, and that is to live a godly life and to follow the example of his Son. And in doing that, God can then work in our lives in ways perhaps unseen to us, and perhaps only at the end of our life will we appreciate how much God has actually done. Brother Roberts, to conclude, Jacob illustrates plainly the angelic nature of what we call providence, giving affairs an intelligent bent this way and that as occasion requires, without showing his hand. Remember, there was 40 years where there was nothing evidenced. Where the angels do not operate, providence is not at work, but affairs are left to work themselves out on unnatural principles. Yet angelic operations in ordinary life are not distinguishable from the effect of nature. Results induced appearing natural. We cannot discover their hand and need not make the attempt. Our part is to fear God, keep the commandments, and go forth with courage and trust, believing the assurance that all things work together for good for those who love God. So let us take the great example of Jacob and see that even in evil times, in hard times, in tribulation, in things hard to understand, the angels are very much at work. And one day perhaps we will understand how much they've actually done, even though we were unaware of it.